Hello, this is Brian Auten of Apologetics315. Today I'm speaking with William Lane Craig. For many, he needs no introduction. He's the research professor of philosophy at Talbot School of Theology in La Mirada, California. He's authored or edited over 30 books, including The Kalam Cosmological Argument, Philosophical Foundations for a Christian Worldview, and Reasonable Faith, now in its third edition. His impact as a Christian scholar, theologian, and apologist are tremendous. He is a prolific debater and author, and his ministry has been extremely influential worldwide. So, Dr. Craig, thank you for taking the time to do this interview.
Delighted to be with you, Brian.
First, I just want to talk about a couple of the things that you're involved in right now. Could you tell us about the Reasonable Faith Chapter Initiative? What's your vision for that, and how's it been progressing?
It occurred to me that many Christians who are interested in going deeper in the life of the mind and in Christian discipleship feel intellectually isolated because there aren't other people in their local church or their community to whom they can talk about these things. And it seemed to me that it would be a great idea for Reasonable Faith to start these local chapters that would bring together people like this so that they would find others who are interested in similar questions and who care about apologetics and Christian doctrine. And so we founded this initiative to start local Reasonable Faith chapters on university campuses as well as in local churches to provide a forum for fellowship and mutual stimulation and outreach in the area of apologetics and doctrine.
So have you been pretty pleased with the results so far?
Yes, I have. The applications continue to come in steadily. I've forgotten the exact number of chapters that are up now, but I noticed just last night that some new ones had now gone online. And so Chris Shannon, who's in charge of this, is just doing a great job of shepherding people through the application process and constantly adding new chapters each month.
Well, we're excited about it over here, located in Belfast. Our chapter starts today, the time that this interview will be posted. So if there's anyone listening in Belfast area, then you're invited to come along. Now, your recent book, God is Great, God is Good, has won the Christianity Today Book Award 2009 for Best Apologetics and Evangelism Book. I enjoyed the book very much, so I'm looking forward to your next release, which is March 2010, entitled On Guard. Can you tell us a little bit about that book?
Certainly. The book, Reasonable Faith, is a book that is written at a seminary level. It's primarily a textbook for university graduates, and as a result, it's really too difficult for the average layperson in the church. And so I wanted to have a book that would be on a simpler, more introductory level that could be used in Sunday school classes or men's Bible study or other small groups that would help the average layman be able to give it a reason for the hope that's in him. And so that's what this new book, On Guard, is designed to do. It takes the same sort of arguments that are presented in Reasonable Faith or my other book, Philosophical Foundations for a Christian Worldview, and makes it accessible to the average person.
As long as we're talking about current events, do you have any debates coming up that we should be looking out for?
Yes, on March 1st, I'm going to be out at Oregon State University where I have a debate with the very vociferous and outspoken atheist physicist, Victor Stenger, and we'll be debating on the existence of God. Then later in the month, I'll be at a couple of universities in North Carolina where I'll be debating the philosopher Michael Tooley and then a local atheist figure named Herb Silverman.
Now, for those who aren't familiar with your background, how did you actually get started in apologetics?
Well, I wasn't raised in a Christian family or even a church-going family. But when I became a Christian, I was immediately confronted with explaining to my younger brother as well as to my high school friends why I'd made this radical decision. And so right from the very beginning, I was involved in giving reasons for Christian faith. When I went off to Wheaton College to study, the wonderful gift that Wheaton gave to me was the integration of my faith and learning. They taught me to develop a Christian world and life view. And it was there that I formed the vision of presenting the gospel in such a way that it would appeal not only to the heart but also to the head. That is to say, satisfying the intellectual demands of a person as well as his emotional needs.
As you were starting out there, were there particular books or apologists or other major influences for you in like your early days?
Yes, there certainly were. One of the most important books that I read as a college student was Edward John Carnell's book, Introduction to Christian Apologetics. I had never read a book like this. Carnell was interacting with questions that I had that no one else had addressed, and it just captivated my interest. So that initial book by E.J. Carnell was very influential in my life. Later, a book by Stuart Hackett called The Resurrection of Theism was also tremendously influential because it was Hackett who convinced me that the project of natural theology, that is to say, giving arguments for God's existence, is a very viable one.
What are your main influences right now, presently?
Well, I would say the work of Alvin Plantinga continues to be a tremendous influence on me. Also, currently, I'm working on the relationship between God and abstract objects, trying to understand God's aseity or self-existence. And so I've been very influenced by writers like Marc Balaguer, who writes on anti-realism in mathematics, which I find to be a very congenial view from a Christian point of view.
Now, for those people who are just getting started in apologetics and they feel they want to go deeper, what direction would you point them in as far as resources or books?
Well, I think in terms of resources, Lee Strobel's books are a great place for the beginner to start. Things like The Case for Christ and The Case for a Creator are good entry-level books. Paul Little's Know Why You Believe is also a good book for beginners. And then once you've hit that level, then I would encourage you to go on to take a look at something like Reasonable Faith. And ultimately, I think what you'll want to do is get into philosophy. You're going to need to study some logic and basic introduction to philosophy at some point. I would recommend for those who have gotten that far to look at my and J.P. Moreland's book, Philosophical Foundations for a Christian Worldview.
Now, let's say you're talking to someone who they found apologetics and it's really helped them. They feel like they really want to get into that. They know that they can go a couple different routes. They could go sort of a heavy educational route where they could go to seminary or Biola and take the apologetics program there or something like that. Or what about someone who can't go that route and they have a family and they want to educate themselves? What are the different routes someone could go, and what are the factors that play into that?
Well, there are distance learning programs that are available. In this day of the Internet, it is possible to do long-distance study electronically. I know, for example, that Biola has a program in apologetics at the master's degree level that one can do via the Internet. The other thing that a person could do would be to try to find a mentor locally under whom you could study, someone who would direct your reading and talk to you about the issues as you go through them. It's very important, I think, not to just read randomly or try to do self-directed study, because it's almost going to be inevitable that you'll wander into all sorts of dead ends and rabbit trails and waste a lot of time. You really need a mentor to guide you into the pertinent literature. So if you're not involved in some sort of a formal program, I think it would be important to try to find somebody who would be willing to be a mentor to you.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's say you're speaking to someone who is going the formal route. Are there particular areas of study that you think are ripe for getting into?
Well, I'm not sure about the issue of things being ripe. Let me talk more about what would be essential. I think that regardless of which area of apologetics someone wants to go into, whether it be philosophical or historical apologetics or scientific apologetics or psychology. I think that everybody would benefit from having a good dose of philosophical training at the beginning. I find that over and over again, people in New Testament studies or in the hard sciences make elementary philosophical blunders because they're not trained in philosophical analysis and logical argumentation. So I think a basic course in logic is really essential, as well as some familiarity with the basic issues of philosophy and perhaps the history of philosophy. So I'm quite convinced of the value of some introductory level philosophical training for everyone, regardless of what field of specialization he goes into.
Now, in your weekly Reasonable Faith podcast with Kevin Harris, you cover so many topics and questions. So in composing some of my questions for you today, I want to focus on some of the things that can equip apologists to have, like character, habits, life skills that will enable them to make a long-term impact. So, for instance, in your final chapter of Reasonable Faith, you end by saying that the ultimate apologetic is how you live your life. So could you elaborate on that a little bit more?
Yes. Jesus said that when people see how we as Christians love one another, that they will know that we represent the truth and that what he says is true. So ultimately, the way in which people, I think, see Christ incarnated is in ourselves as we reproduce his life in us. So it's really important that we not be simply cerebral, just brains. We also have to be people whose character is like the character of Christ. And that involves a spiritual formation, a character formation that takes place over time as we are disciples of Jesus and are conformed to his image.
Would you say that there are certain essential habits? You talked about certain areas of essential study, but what sort of essential habits do you think are essential for the Christian apologist? I'm thinking, of course, devotionally, but also in the area of study and homework.
Okay. Well, I was thinking primarily devotionally in terms of having a regular time of Bible study and prayer and meaningful worship once a week, at least on Sunday, where one can really worship the Lord with one's heart as well as with one's mind. I think there's a real danger of people in apologetics becoming so cerebral that the religious affections atrophy, and I think we need to cultivate those as well. But then in the other areas of one's life, I think inculcating discipline is one of the most important qualities, the ability to be autonomous and not need to have someone standing over us all the time ordering us what to do. We need to be self-motivated and able to launch out on our own in a very disciplined way. Diligence would be another biblical quality that we need to inculcate. That is to say, not to be lazy or procrastinating, but to be hard workers who are able to apply ourselves to a job. Diligence would be very important. I think having good time management is a vital skill so that we don't waste time, but really are good stewards of our time. Those would be some of the personal qualities I think would be important to inculcate.
Mm-hmm. What skill do you think you would want to encourage?
Well, I guess I would say, again, the ability to analyze something, the ability to think logically, to look at an argument or a position and discern the assumptions or presuppositions, to see the logical missteps, to be able to discern what inferences are being made and whether or not those are valid. I think this ability to think analytically is a real prize that we need to develop. And this doesn't come overnight. It comes through time and practice. But that, I think, is one of the most important qualities that we can develop, is the ability to think analytically.
Well, what do you think has helped you to develop that? I'm wondering, all right, what does that look like in practical application?
Well, way in which one can develop this is by imitating others. It's very good to look at people who are skilled analytically and see how they do philosophy. So, for example, take George Mavrodes, who is a Christian philosopher at the University of Michigan. Mavrodes has a mind like a steel trap. He is so good analytically. And so when Mavrodes does a paper, or when I'm in a meeting where he's in the audience and he asks a question, boy, my ears immediately prick up because I want to see how his mind works. How does he ask a question? How does he probe for the assumptions of an argument? Or if I hear him serving as a respondent to someone else's paper, I'll want to pay special attention to how his mind works. Similarly, with a person like Alvin Plantinga, you read his works, you hear him when he's in a meeting, and you observe and watch how this man thinks, how he analyzes something, and then you try to imitate that. You try to acquire the same sorts of tools, and then you exercise it. You try to analyze an argument that you're presented with and required to respond to. And as you exercise these skills, you'll get better and better at it so that it starts to come automatically. Certain logical fallacies will just jump out at you when you hear them. You don't even have to think about it. They just disclose themselves to you because you've learned to think in those sorts of categories.
So you would say constant exposure and imitation of good critical thinkers and things like that.
Exactly. This can be done either in person, if you have the privilege of hearing them and watching them, or by reading their books and seeing how they go about analyzing an argument and interacting with it.
Mm-hmm. So I want to ask you a question about communication skills. People see your debates and they can see the skills that you've developed and your manner with communicating and in the clarity that you communicate with. What sort of advice would you give for developing that sort of a skill?
I would suggest that people take courses in public speaking. It is astonishing what power there is in being a good public speaker. You can have all the brains in the world and all the great ideas, but if you can't communicate well, you're not going to be very effective in persuading others. On the other hand, if you're a good public speaker, it's really amazing how you can move people to the conclusion that you want them to come to. So I would really encourage listeners to enroll in public speaking courses and then practice writing and delivering speeches of their own and getting feedback. I was a speech and communications major in college, and I consider that training to have just been invaluable. I did my public speaking training in high school and in university, as I say, by majoring in speech. But I know there are courses that are offered in local colleges and so forth to people from the community if they want to take courses in public speaking. So almost any college would be able, I think, to offer some of the basic techniques of being a good public speaker. And then it's just a matter of practicing.
Just for those who are listening, I would recommend Toastmasters. It's been a program that's very effective and gives you a lot of opportunity to practice and takes you through a systematic regimen of learning different particular skills in public speaking.
Excellent.
Throw that out there for the listeners as well.
Good.
Now, as far as debate, that's played a notable role in your ministry, obviously. So do you mind me asking what sort of preparation goes into a typical debate for you? What's that involve?
Primarily, it would involve reading the work of the opponent that I will be debating. So I'll get his books and articles that are relevant to the topic. I'll read them, and then I'll see what case he presents, what objections to his case I would have, and then I will try to anticipate on the basis of his work what objections to my case he would raise, and then prepare responses to those potential objections. And that would be the most important thing to do in preparation for a debate. Of course, you've got to write your opening speech, but I typically use pretty much the same arguments each time, so it would mean just tweaking that opening speech a little bit to make it relevant to the particular opponent that I'm meeting on that occasion.
after all your debates, do you still get nervous, or do you get nervous at all?
Sure. I think that's always good to have a little bit of nervousness because it gets the adrenaline pumping, keeps you on the edge. That's normal. And then once you get into it, it disappears.
Yeah. Now, of course, we're involved in like a battle of ideas when we're doing apologetics, but how and to what extent do you view apologetics as spiritual warfare?
Well, I guess I think of apologetics, Brian, as a theoretical discipline, and therefore primarily something that is involved in the life of the mind. I don't think that the soundness or the validity of arguments is affected by spiritual considerations. An argument is either sound or it's not, and it's just irrelevant whether it's got some sort of spiritual overtones to it or not. I think where the warfare aspect would come in would be more in the practical application of this theoretical discipline in evangelism and discipleship. And certainly there one will encounter hardness of heart, close-mindedness, perhaps even hostility on the part of certain persons that ultimately is a matter of spiritual warfare, I think. And then, of course, I believe there is an enemy of our souls who is bent on our destruction and would do anything if he could get us to fall into the pit of immorality or sin in some way that would make us ineffective. So that also is something that one needs to watch out for. So I think of those things as coming in or being relevant with respect to the practical application of this discipline.
Well, here's a question regarding family. My wife and I have 2 little girls that we're raising, and as they get older, I think about how to use the things I'm learning apologetically to point them in the right direction with right ideas, help them to think critically, and like equip them for the culture that they'll grow up in. What sort of advice do you have for the role of apologetics in raising kids?
Well, I think that it's important to start from the youngest age, sharing in simple ways with them what good reasons there are to believe. So it's very easy, for example, with a little child to say something like, where did everything come from? There must have been someone that created everything, and that was God. That would be a very simple statement of the cosmological argument that would prepare the way for future, more sophisticated discussions. Or you show them the intricate structure of a leaf and say, isn't it marvelous the way this leaf is designed to receive the sunlight and turn it into glucose for the nourishment of this plant. Look how beautifully designed this is. And there you see you've set the stage for a teleological argument. Or you could talk to the little child about why certain things are right or wrong, and about how these moral values are ultimately from God. Those are all very simple ways in which you make the ground fallow for future, more sophisticated statements of these arguments.
Mm-hmm. One of the things I found in your Philosophy of Religion DVD curriculum, you included a number of sage tips for those in seminary and learning. And one of them
I didn't realize that was on that DVD.
Yeah, your devotional parts, and I thought those were real helpful.
Thank you.
But one of them had to do with putting your marriage first and your studies second.
Yeah.
Now, I thought that'd be something that you could elaborate on here.
Right. If you succeed academically, but your marriage falls apart and it ends in divorce, then ultimately in God's sight, you're really a failure on this very personal level. So we mustn't buy academic success at the expense of our mates and our children. We need to recognize that after God, they're the number one priority in our lives, and be prepared to make such sacrifices as are necessary for their well-being and nurture.
What do you think that the apologists' long-term goals should be in their ministry?
Well, collectively, I think that our goal is nothing less than to try to turn back the Enlightenment. I think that the Enlightenment secular mentality that has swept Europe and the West needs to be ultimately reversed so that we bring back theology as a source of knowledge and a wisdom tradition. So that means overcoming that sort of secularization that is the result of the Enlightenment that makes man autonomous and denies that there is such a thing as theological knowledge. Individually, I think we need to each ask God for what calling He has in our lives. And there it may look very, very different, whether one perhaps feels called to become a university professor, or maybe a campus minister, or maybe an evangelist, or some other sort of ministry. There, one's personal life goals will be contingent upon the specific calling that God has for you.
Well, what are your thoughts on calling? I'm sure there's people listening who are kind of at a crossroads in their life. They're saying, well, God, what do you want me to do? Or, how do they find that out? What would be your advice in giving them wisdom, a wise path to take?
Well, I do believe that God has a specific will for each of our lives. I don't agree with people who say that God's will is just a sort of general will for moral rectitude and conformity to the Christ, but that it's a matter of indifference to God, whether you become, say, a professor or a plumber, or whether you take Susan to be your wife or Judy. I think that these are not a matter of indifference to God, and that He has a specific will and calling for your life that He wants you to seek. And I think we can trust Him, the Holy Spirit, to guide us into that as we step out on faith and move forward. The Proverbs promises that as we trust in the Lord with all of our hearts and don't lean on our own understanding, that He will direct our paths. He will guide us in His will. So I would say complete submission to God, body and soul as a living sacrifice, like Romans 1 and 2, is the prerequisite then for being filled with the Holy Spirit and being guided by God into His will for you.
Now, Dr. Craig, as we start to wrap this up, my question would be, what legacy do you hope to leave?
Oh, gosh. I hope to leave a body of written work that will continue to influence people long after I'm gone. I hope that the things that I publish on the nature and attributes of God will make a long-term contribution to Christian theism, to theology, and to Christian philosophy. And I hope that I also will be used by the Lord to raise up a new generation of younger philosophers and theologians who will have a similar vision for their lives and who will carry this tidal wave, which is a renaissance of Christian thinking, forward into the next generation.
Well, Dr. Craig, I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with me today.
Glad to do it, Brian.
Also, just want to thank you for all your labor in Christ, and thank your wife, Jan, as well, for the contribution that she's made.
Yeah, I couldn't do it without her. And I want to wish you all the best with your venture with the Reasonable Faith chapter there in Belfast. I hope things just go wonderfully for you all.
We've been speaking with philosopher and Christian apologist William Lane Craig. You can find his resources at reasonablefaith.org, including articles, questions and answers, podcasts, and other great media. And all these links and more can be found on today's blog entry at Apologetics315. So be sure to pick up his most recent book, On Guard. This is Brian Otten of Apologetics315, and thanks for listening.